audio work? Yeah, that looks like it's working. Let's see if, well, we'll wait for our YouTube to update and then we'll have a weird thing in the backlog where people get to watch us get ready. I feel like I really understand the pain of like broadcast TV or something. Like the lag time is really weird. Yeah, now it looks better, actually. Anyway, all right. I never do a very good intro to these things. Original idea here was we employ a lot of fascinating people who, kind of make Urbit what it is, but no one knows who they are unless you're on the network. So one way to explain who they are is just to talk to them and make that public and easy to find. Usually I just ask people about their background and how they ended up finding Urbit, actually, which is embarrassingly often because I don't even know exactly the whole story, and I find it interesting to learn the whole story. Obviously, I know something about it usually, but not the whole thing. In this case, you and I were having a conversation while we were in the woods the other day that was kind of like, yeah, it was like open-ended in a good way about something I think we'd both like to make more concrete. And while we were talking about it, I was like, oh, we should just do a stream and talk about this because it's interesting, and we could probably talk about it quite a lot for a long time. And once you're actually talking to the public, which we are now, then it's sort of like a different thing, and it forces you to try and organize your thinking to varying degrees of success. So yeah, anyway, for anyone who doesn't know, Philip is now CTO of Tlon. I don't even know if we ever announced that publicly, so that's exciting. And has taken over, all of like leading basically like Urbit infrastructure development. Urbit is of course a community project, and so there are other people who contribute significantly to that who aren't even employed by Tlon. But as far as like our infrastructure projects, you're the guy. And I mean, what else do people need to know about you? I don't know. People should know you from if they're interested in Urbit. That like I feel like you need no introduction for anyone who's actually watching this thing. So anyway, we'll skip that. I don't know. There's no structure to this program anyway. But maybe, all right, you want me to try and like draw you out into the same conversation, or you want to like try and tee up the sort of the prerequisites for what we were chatting about?
Sure, yeah. I'm gonna rely on you to draw out the answers because um I'm not sure that like I haven't been able so far to distill it down into like a blog post or something of that
Yeah.
nature. But the like on the like a place where
Here,
I
actually,
generally go for it.
I'm just going to cut you off because I actually have I'm remembering now that you're even, stumbling around. I'm like, oh, no, no, I remember. We were talking about how one of the funny things about Urbit's like public reputation is that people often think that Urbit is about privacy or it's about like sort of like cryptographic ownership or these things that have become really popular, right? So like
Yes.
because the rise of Signal or the rise of or the decline of kind of centralized services, there are these sort of meme level reasons that people care about decentralization. And that's good for us generally, but it actually isn't quite getting to like the larger point of why Urbit is built the way that it is and what we're kind of on about in general, which I tend to think of as having to do with ownership. So people think, oh, it's really important that I have, like that everything that I do is completely encrypted. Okay, yeah, sure, but I would say what's really important is that you actually, if you had something that you owned, of course, your communications between that and other things would be encrypted because that would kind of be downstream from you having, good, intuitively straightforward ownership over what you're doing. And anyway, I think that's what I think of as the seed of this, and that you were, I think, kind of riffing on that and talking about how like maybe it's a little bit more than that. It's not like ownership alone, because ownership has implications for like how you build what you build. Is that more or less correct? Or is that kind of like the top of the pyramid? I don't know.
Yeah, there's um like Urbit as a project has been around for so long that it has ridden several waves. And whenever we're writing a particular wave, it feels like, um, that was like why Urbit was written. People think of Urbit as a crypto project, you know,
Yeah.
um, it, when it predates, like in largely its current form, it predates even Bitcoin. Um,
Yeah.
People think of it as primarily about privacy because they're like, oh well, that's what everyone thinks about now, and
Yeah.
it originally, wasn't about that. Um, and yet, the reason that it kind of naturally, um, why it's so easy to mistake it for being a project built for this purpose, for whatever people care about in the moment, is that the goal of Urbit was to basically build something more more natural, simpler, more correct. That'll and the theory was, if you do that all the way down to the foundation, then everything above it will get better. And so, to some extent, whenever people start caring about something, the answer is always, oh well, if Urbit if everyone used Urbit, then this would be solved,
Right.
which makes it feel like it's built for whatever people care about at any given moment.
Yeah, I think that like so maybe there are two kind of threads that are super or like that are interesting to me anyway. One of them is kind of like I think we internally, both to the community and the company, have a good intuition for thinking about how to continue kind of like maintain the spirit of building things that is kind of implicit in a way already in what Urbit is, if that makes sense. So, but it's strange because it is kind of hard to articulate. But I don't think that's because it's unclear or it doesn't make sense, honestly. Although I understand why people I think often are critical of Urbit for this reason, basically, because I think they kind of trip on the like, why is Urbit this way? And we actually don't have a simple enough explanation. And so there's one side of this which would be like, just can we refine that explanation such that then maybe the deliverable would be, yeah, you have almost like our marketing gets better. Um, but one of the interesting things to me, if you think about the more successful projects that have like pioneered some of these more, now well-known kind of meme tier ways of that things are like Bitcoin or sort of like PGP. Um, I think they were similar to Urbit in that way, right? That they were more about like, hey, we just want to build this thing in a way that actually is correct and makes sense, and is kind of like well reasoned from the standpoint of like, how do you make something that is very durable or I don't know, like feels very well structured, which I think is like really hard to articulate. And it's also hard to say to kind of market to someone, say, hey, you should be really excited about this because it's just really nicely made. Like it's actually what people are excited about is the felt effect of that thing, Like you don't buy a Porsche because, oh, I love the way that they went about engineering it. Like you buy it because you of like the way it makes you feel when you drive it or the way it makes you feel when you're next to it, and you can kind of try and articulate what those things feel like, if that makes sense. Um, which also makes me think that sometimes I'm like, I don't know whether it's our job even. It's like our job is to make the thing really good and to be good at having that sort of distinguishing intuition for what it is. Like I sort of oscillate back and forth on this. I'm like, our job is only to make something that is excellent. And then I'm like, maybe actually what we really need if we want more people to help us with that, and we want more people to use this thing, is to also articulate why it matters that this thing is so sort of so polished or is like made in a particular way.
Yeah,
I don't
but
know if you
even
feel that same tension.
like, yeah, I mean, even if the people who buy Porsches are looking for kind of the results of it and not thinking about particularly, like, they're not buying it because they think of it as, in theory, it's a well-made car. They're thinking of it as the experience is good. The people building Porsches are, as I understand it, not thinking that way. They're thinking, okay, how do you build a good car?
Yeah.
Um, and that doesn't mean the entire company is thinking that way. or the entire community of people around Porsches. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but
Right.
there
Yes.
is a
So there are
core of
these
people that are
two.
not that way.
Right. So we can kind of separate out these two things, right? There's like, it's almost like there's marketing, which is basically what is the storytelling about the sort of felt effects of this thing, which is its own thicket of problems that I'm very familiar with. And there's another thread, which is basically how do you articulate kind of the engineer? Yeah, like what is the culture? What is the engineering culture of this thing? And how do you clearly articulate what the values are or whatever, what the kind of principles of that engineering culture are? Because sure, like the people who sit around trying to design and engineer Porsches certainly have a culture and a set of and like kind of a way of thinking that governs the way that they make things. And if you're going to sustain an institution that does that, you have to be able to like articulate those values basically or make them like explicit. Um, and maybe that is kind of like what we were starting to dig into. And this is where we started talking about SQLite, I think, at least in that like prior conversation, right? Where it's like, how do you kind of like, how do you explain the level of kind of like durability, reliability, I don't know, sort of like thoroughness, but that is reflected in a very, in something that is like elegantly designed. And it's kind of hard to like put your finger on.
Yeah, exactly. When like for this, the side of the project that is infrastructure development, the like our in some level our fundamental claim is that we are able to write better software than other people, that we just know how to do it better. Um, and that's not necessarily because we have, more people or more experienced people or smarter people, but that we've hit on basically a better process for building software. Um, and unlike a lot of projects, we're not saying that we're able to build any particular piece of software that nobody else has been able to build, right? We're not able, we're not saying we can get something that'll run faster, or have any particular like even like sort of obviously measurable um, characteristics.
Right.
Um, what we're saying is that we think we can write so like
Yeah.
software that is better, and
Yeah, yeah.
what does
Yeah, why is it
what
better?
makes it
Well,
better, right?
so one of the things that's interesting about this is that I think of this, I do think there's a very strong distinction between basically industrial scale software or like industrial software writ large, right? Which is basically software that serves, which is like one to many, meaning there is one instance of this software, whatever it might be. Like, I mean, it's very much like it's like sort of server side software kind of, or centrally maintained software. I guess it's just centralized software, right? So if there's one company that is maintaining, and I've been thinking about this actually as it relates to our marketing too, because there's a very specific character. When something is maintained by a single entity, that entity can like has the responsibility of control, I guess, right? So it's like the way that they are, because they control the entire stack, like they control the application that gets delivered to you, they control the server side code that runs. The their metrics are around efficiency, right? They aren't around extensibility or customizability or durability. It doesn't have anything to do with like a customer running the thing, right? Because they are the ultimately the company controls the quality of experience in terms of like they just deliver they control the whole thing. They're not actually delivering anything. And so I think that like I almost feel like the rules of the game for building software when you are delivering that software to a person, like the person runs that software basically independently, potentially. Like that's a completely set of that's like a totally different ethos. It's like a different way of thinking, and it actually boils down to even it's a different way of working and thinking about. I'm not sure it has to do with better. I think it's more like we are the only or one of very few like organizations really who think about that like are trying to figure that out, and I'm not sure if we've completely figured it out, but I think we've started to figure it out, and I think it's almost just like this characteristically different thing. Um, but I don't know whether do you feel like you get tripped up on that? Sometimes I feel like we get tripped up, like oftentimes I feel like there's this kind of like we're like, no, it's better to build software this way. I'm like, well, I mean, like it's just a totally different thing. Does that seem strike you as basically correct or not?
Um, yeah, like it's just a totally different thing is kind of the right way to think about it. It's like I feel like it's like I prefer it, and but
Right.
the measures that you would use to evaluate SaaS software, for example,
Mhm.
um, are just completely different than the measures that we would use, and so they are,
Mhm.
as they would say, incommensurate. Um, and so to evaluate which one, like it's not something that you can come in from one paradigm or the other and be convinced to the other through, uh, you know, through rational argument uh, or numbers or evidence. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
a lot of it is, I don't know if aesthetic is quite the right word, but it's like, how do you want to live your life?
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, I've thought about
and
that a lot.
yeah,
Like one of the things that we don't, that I always want to be like careful about, but I also think is important to concede is that the reason, like, why would you build software in this way? Like, why do we even care about doing this? And, you can think of it like, I mean, I think this is something people trip over all the time. You read critiques of Urbit, and you read these critiques where they're like, I don't know, yeah, I feel like they're kind of like they're comparing it to SaaS, basically. They're like, oh, this isn't a great SaaS tool. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, no shit. Like it's completely unrelated. And not only is it unrelated, it has like these totally different priors about like what we want compute, like how we think about computers in terms of their effect on society, basically, or like effect on the world in general. Like the very top level prior has to do with, hey, we think about computers as open-ended tools. Like this is an open-ended tool that people should be able to do lots of different things with. Like it's a tool in the purest, like ancient sense. This is a tool that people can use for stuff that we don't expect and we don't pretend to expect, and we want it to be sort of refined in such a way that it can outlive us. It can outlive the people that maintain it. And definitely embedded in that is actually this conceit that like that is a good thing, like capital G, capital T, like that is the right way to, that is the, there is, I think, embedded in it just this sense of like, that's the right way to do things. And actually there's something slightly suspicious about the other, about the opposite, which is that it depends on its maintainer for some indeterminate amount of time. I
right.
think
And
I'm always a little reticent to get into that argument, basically, because it's like, but sometimes I wonder whether it's also, but then I think it can be confusing for people. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm like, yeah, I'm like, do I want to have that argument with everybody? Not really, but also like maybe you should know. That's why I tend to come back to like, I'm like, it's just a different thing. Okay, like, I don't have to convince you this is the right thing. We just have like a different way of thinking about it.
right, yeah, you're building a different kind of software. I like the example of SQLite is a good one, and other software in that kind of space, because with something like SQLite, you are shipping it to people instead of
Yep.
maintaining it yourself. And people will use it for all kinds of random things. And you may hear about some of them, but you're not even going to hear about all of them. Um,
It's
and
also,
on
yeah,
some
go ahead.
level, all like our only unique claim is that that kind of way of thinking about software as a tool is something that end users should be able to experience, and nobody else
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
that, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, that's a very important point. That's kind of like the clarifying point of that kind of like top level thing, which is that it's like we I think this is also confusing to people where it's like the motivating impulse to build this thing is to be able to get into the hands of an individual something they can use day to day as an open-ended thing. Like that, and it in a simple enough, understandable enough way that it like feels like a tool. But that's where it gets a little bit vague. It's like, well, what the fuck does that mean? It's like, well, I'll know it when I see it. Uh, and I could give you examples of it or whatever, but it's admittedly vague. I mean, I don't think it's admittedly vague. And I think that's like, um, that's super important, right? That it's like that's where the kind of like we are, like the Porsche engineering team or whatever is motivated by that felt effect. You're like, we're trying to deliver this felt effect, which has to do with this combination of sort of freedom and fun or whatever it is, And I do think that has to be that's a part of what's motivating the, the way that you actually then go and materially build the thing. Like I think those things are connected, like
Yeah,
very
although
much so, actually.
like I also think that while viewing it as, and viewing Urbit as an attempt to build tools for life, is closer to the root. I actually like, in my mind, that's still a derived concept. Um, but it's like all of the derived concepts, and the more derived they are, the more defensible they are, right? It's much easier to
Yeah,
go into
yeah.
Hacker News and say, big companies are bad and you should own your own data, right? That's much easier to defend than you should have general purpose tools. But even that is easier to defend than whatever the next level up is, which is something along the lines of um, software that is simple in some mechanical sense, um, is a better foundation for like the future development of software, and that anything that is too complex and that tends to become more complex is an evolutionary dead end. It'll get better
Yeah.
and better, and it'll be a better and better experience, but it's going to then reach a local maximum, and there will be nowhere further to go unless you dive all the way back down to something that's actually simple. And so part of the thesis of Urbit is that lots and lots and lots of software is going off toward an evolutionary dead end in that sense.
That's
And
interesting.
that will that at some point, assuming that everything keeps on going, some way or another, someone will stray far enough away from the local maximum that they'll find a way onto, to something higher. Um, and it's almost demoralizing to work near the local maximum if you've somehow caught a glimpse of the other peak that's so much higher.
Oh, right. Yeah, like if you know that you're yeah, 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 yeah. If you know that this thing has is gonna stall out at a certain point, or that you're kind of like the curvature has shifted to from acceleration to like deceleration or whatever. Um,
Right.
then yeah, it's weird how much yeah, I often feel like that this is kind of a sidebar, but it's like you can sense that kind of insecurity in a lot of the skepticism of even like any effort to um, kind of like explore radical, approaches to building software in general, Urbit or anything else. It's like people like, I mean, it's understandable. It's almost like a sunk cost. You can tell people are like, I spent my whole fucking career on this. Like, it's not a dead end, And you're like, look, man, it's not personal, okay? Like, like, like I do think, yeah, there is this something very, it's like kind of like insecure or something going on there.
Right. And,
But
and you
anyway,
can resolve this a few different ways, right? You can say, okay, I'm actually a programmer who uh, even though my software is not going to last, for particularly long, and I can see, in some sense, why not? Uh, there's a lot of people that will use it in the meantime, and that's a good thing, almost as a
yeah, yeah.
like, a service worker.
Yeah, I mean, there are
And
lots of
software as a
things that
service
are,
does a good job of that, But if your mindset is I'm trying to build actually good software that is, people are going to build on in the future, like if you're that kind of person who wants to do that, then it doesn't work.
right. Yeah. Right, right. Well, that's what I'm talking about where there's something about this kind of like top level prior, right, which has to do with like it's just like what kind of effect do you want to have on the world? Like, yeah, if you're comfortable being a service provider or something, or if you can the ethos of that is like amenable to you, which I think boils ultimately down to like responsibility, or you have like the faith in the community that's going to maintain that service or whatever. Which actually, I think there are like very legitimate cases in which that just like makes complete sense. I don't think like all software has to be, like a hammer or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like
That can,
there are real people alive right now, and if you can make their lives better, that is like also a
yeah,
good thing.
yeah. I mean, I think that's completely fine. Um, and I think the way that you think about building those kinds of things is different. I always want to go, like, for me, I think a lot about, so I think this distinction between, right, like, yeah, okay, maybe there's a way of making things that is going to kind of like reach a local maximum. And I think you're talking about for a particular use case, right? For the use case, which is, how do I use this for myself? It's like sort of like I can only use software as a service, as a kind of personal communication or whatever tool, for so long, right? Because it becomes, both the software itself becomes so complex to serve so many different needs, um, and over the long term, the needs of an individual with regards to their sort of like personal tooling, actually, like, there's a conflict there between software as a service and like, I just want a tool that I can write with for my entire life, that is like unresolvable. Like, they're not actually the same thing. But that, anyway, the thing that I'm interested in, or have always been interested in, and I've never been able to come with really good examples for, is that it seems like that way of um, basically this kind of like refactoring of infrastructure is a natural occurrence. Like, it's a historically normal thing that we get like more and more complicated systems. Then eventually we're like, okay, look, it's almost like we're evolving a use case around what we're able to engineer, instead of engineering for the use case. And actually, we have to abandon this method of engineering and think of another way, basically. So intuitively, that when I think about this, which I've obviously, or like, if you work on this project, you can't help but think about, I think, or I don't know, for me, it's like, I'm like, okay, what's an example of that? Like, are there examples of that historically? Because I agree that, or I tend to think that like physical infrastructure, or just like things that we've developed over long periods of history, has gone through the same refinement process, right? Because like the ways in which we build buildings or build cars or build whatever, like things that we really need, those processes have to be they basically have to be decentralized. They have to be not really owned by anybody, or they're owned by like a large collection of people. They have to be simple enough that people can remember them, like that, and so on and so forth. Like, and so, but I've always struggled then to like be like, oh, this is exactly how building technology changed, or like, I don't know, physical manufacturing changed, or anyway, this line of thinking might be
Yeah,
kind of a dead end, but
I mean, like the physical manufacturing of cars went from, if I remember, I went from basically handcrafting approximately to mass production to the Toyota way, and each of those was not really a refinement on the previous one. Um,
yeah, that's true.
it and the previous ones didn't even look like they were necessarily going to fail, although it became less and less tenable to do something like handcrafting when you just had more and more demand. And with mass production, you just had more and more, like basically you just had worse and worse quality as you scaled up,
Yeah,
or at
okay, that
least it became
actually,
more obvious. Yeah,
yeah, that's a good example, because you can see the same thing with building technology, right? It's like, we, you know, important cultural fixtures in the physical environment are basically built by hand over long periods of time. They're very Baroque, certainly for the Baroque period, but Baroque in the sense that they're complicated, and they require a lot of individual effort and a lot of maintenance. And then we invent simpler technologies that can be further distributed, such that people can basically build on their own. And those technologies become better and better, such that we can build, relatively durable buildings, with many different groups of people using those same methods or same technologies. Um, yeah, it does definitely feels to me like there's this kind of force of it is kind of like the force of decentralization or something, right? It's like, if there's a technology that is sufficiently useful to people, it will like, it wants to decentralize because it needs to be widely distributed. And when something wants to be widely distributed, it sort of like, it rips through centralization naturally. Do you know what I'm saying? Like people want to They want access to an immediate access to or timely access to that technology. And so they're willing to basically, they want to disintermediate it, like just society wants that. Uh, it's almost like the biggest question for us is like whether or not we timed it right. We'll leave that aside.
Right.
Uh, because
Yeah.
in most
And
those three or those two examples, I'm like, those are things that happened over really long periods of history. When they did happen, they happened very fast. But like that inflection point, that like point of change is if you're not there at the right time, you blew it.
yeah, and I mean, something that's changed is like, um, basically companies are able to scale much, much faster than they were able to before. And so if like the amount of energy that went into something like Facebook, um, like as in the amount of people wanting to get on something like Facebook, if the company Facebook had not been able to scale that much, um, and the only way forward was people kind of building their own stuff, then that would have just happened.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
if
Sure. Yeah, you
if
can see
if
that. Yeah.
AOL was able to like build enough products that the entire internet would have existed within them, then it would have happened. But they were not able to. And companies seem to be more able to do that now. But I don't think that that's um, I don't think that's true of everything, and I don't think that's true. I don't think that's going to continue to be true necessarily.
Yeah.
But
Right.
it's
Yeah,
something
that's
to
a
keep
good.
an eye on, basically.
I mean, you could think of that as kind of like the crux of Urbit's growth, which I'm obviously quite optimistic about in general because I mean I find it like personally quite valuable, but it's basically like if there are things that you can do on a decentralized or whatever on sort of with a personal networked computer that you can't do with a sort of corporate collection of corporate networked computers or whatever, then you're going to see Urbit grow extremely rapidly because that choke point, those like sort of choke point use cases are just going to drive people to adopt it, um, uh, as opposed to sort of it being re-implemented in an existing system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's maybe space for so the normal way that a decentralized technology tends to take over. I don't know if it's a good example because people have a lot of opinions on the subject, but like the Android versus iPhone thing is one where Android does things in a way that encourages more like while it's still not a particularly like for the end user, it's just as much of a product as Apple, just a worse one. But for the developer, it's more of a tool that you can do all kinds of stuff with, and
Right,
for the hardware designer and for all that kind of stuff. And
right.
so a lot of um, like experimentation goes on in the Android world, um, and y- like because of that, it ends up being a mess often. And Apple basically, they do some of their own experimentation, and then they take a lot of ideas that come from the Android world and then just do them so much better.
Yeah,
And so, like, my natural tendency, of course, is I'm much more interested in the Android world because that feels like, something that can generate, um, ways to go forward. Um, and while Apple feels like a better product, it feels to me like an evolutionary dead end. Because how does something like that exist without the actual culture of the company Apple? Um, and
interesting.
I don't mean to argue that particular point, but like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
as an example.
I mean, I would say that they coexist basically. Or it's interesting that it seems likely that they can continue to coexist. It's actually kind of an interesting example. It's not that like the sort of more wild or sort of more experimental world of Android actually is so exciting that that dominates because obviously there are plenty of people who want to live in a way kind of like in this lagging behind but more stable world of iOS. Um, but wait, I want to
Yeah,
talk about SQLite because I kind of think one of the things that might be interesting to dig into are kind of some of the material qualities that like you observe in um, uh, so here let me like maybe I'll set the stage the way I think about this, and then you can tell me if you think it makes sense and maybe kind of keep going. So one of the things like that is really I find is like very hard to communicate to people about this difference between sort of industrial scale software and sort of personal scale, like person scale software, is that for the most part, sort of like individual scale software, human scale software, whatever, when it comes to like the network world, basically doesn't exist. Like they're just really, we don't use anything that actually is on the, is like connected to the internet, um, and actually like uses the network where we have any kind of real actual ownership over it. Um, and and so you kind of like we have these like devices which of course we download something to, and that thing has a mechanism for automatically updating, and it depends on the server. It's basically this completely closed loop. So I can program my laptop, right? I can crack open the terminal. I can do stuff on like you still have basically a PC, but when it comes to anything that is connected to the network, you just like don't really have it. And so, yeah, like what do you look at as examples of software that gets distributed over the network that potentially uses the network, and so on? It's really hard to say. The SQLite example is interesting because it's not actually totally networked, but it has these qualities that we, yeah, can I think agree on that can agree are amazing. So I'm kind of curious how you think those things overlap because like SQLite is not networked, right? So why is it that like this is a sort of compelling example of something that is sort of stable and I don't know long lasting and you can trust.
Right. So while it's not networked, it is like distributed to end users. And um, what's like it's interesting basically on several levels. One is just you know, at the bottom line, they have a piece of software that's incredibly reliable, that's very performant, that gets used in all kinds of stuff, and you can see this from the fact that it's used in like the highest level, like in areas where they require the highest levels of reliability, right? They did a whole bunch of like they wrote I forget how many it is, but it's like millions of lines of codes of tests, so that it could be used um, in commercial flights.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, it is also a piece of software that is so small that any random app is going to reach for it and be used on Raspberry Pis and all kinds of like tiny
Yeah.
stuff. It's not something it's not some big industrial piece of software, but it has uh, but it is industrial strength in a sense.
Yeah.
Um, and the way that it's built is relatively unique. Not unique, but it's like the people involved are interesting. Organizationally, it's interesting. It uses very much a cathedral model of development. So it's open source, but they don't accept outside contributions, as far as I'm aware. And they like something about the way that they build software works really, really well, um, in a way that most tools don't ever get to. You'll see, like there are some of the old Unix tools that feel similarly solid, but most of them are doing much simpler things than a database. And so they're an interesting case study of people who built non-trivial software uh, in a really high quality way.
Yeah. So maybe the crux there is ultimately about it being delivered to potentially a device or yeah, a plane or whatever that is distinctly not networked, um, and it being able to sort of perform that job forever, right? Like that's kind of like that's a criteria that when I think of any pretty much any widely deployed data store, I mean even like they require a lot of maintenance and upgrades and care and feeding or whatever. Right?
Right.
Like this is the thing. This is kind of that's sort of like the bottleneck difference, or kind
Right.
of like
Whereas the
the
goal
primary
with
distinction.
SQLite, it is that it's something that you can use and depend on for a really long time. And I don't know if they expect you to regularly upgrade it. But like I wouldn't be worried about not upgrading it in
Yeah.
general.
Well, it's totally self-contained. It's not like you have like a system level process running, right? Like if I ship a SQLite database with a piece of software, it's self-contained. Like it's a single dependency, and it's not like, oh, you have a system level dependency, you need to also install this thing, and you have the potential for version mismatching and all kinds of other bullshit. It's like it's bundled with your software as a tiny foot. I imagine like you just
Yeah,
include it as binary, right?
yeah, which feels really good. And a challenge for Urbit is can we make it feel like that for software which is networked and
Right.
which therefore does have to talk to other people, and therefore there are things like protocols which are just a consensus for how you talk from one to another. And so it's hard to say how much of that nice feeling you have with SQLite is inseparable from it being actually self-contained. It doesn't talk to
Yeah.
anyone else, and how much of it that we can reproduce in
Yeah,
a
that's a
network
nice way
world.
to think about it. So one thing I've been thinking this whole time is like it's blockchains are kind of like it's almost like there's a gradient. Like you have basically totally centrally contained software, and then you have kind of like minor or staking, whatever, like some or governed networks of software, right? And in that case, it's like it's the API for whatever the EVM, Bitcoin similar, right? Like they change slowly enough. It's actually interesting if you think about long term historically, it's still not very good, but they change slowly enough that people can handle those upgrades, right? And that they expect to
Right,
basically handle the upgrades internally. Like they're not like breaking changes. Um, but it's still not quite what you're talking about or what I think Urbit looks for, which is that kind of like I put the thing on a USB stick, I put it in a drawer, I go to sleep for 10 years and wake up and I plug it in and it can upgrade itself and run again. Um, which actually, now I'm thinking about that was like
right,
one of the things when we were talking about this. It's like it's almost like what you're looking for is a way to describe that as a design constraint, because that is a really important design constraint in the way that I think we think about networking, which is I think what you're talking about, which is like you want it to be as durable and as kind of like totally self-contained as SQLite, right? Sealed off from the underlying operating system, and it can handle. It has someone drilling your. Uh,
I
this is
guess
where
so.
like then the guys they drill the lock and
Yeah, jump out
um,
the window, into the ocean. No, um,
yeah, this is the first Tlon TV episode that gets 1 million views where Philip gets kidnapped. Um, uh, anyway, yeah, let's see. So, uh, sorry for
yeah,
causing myself to lose my own train of thought. Um,
yeah. The example there, unless you want to keep going,
no, go
but
ahead.
like,
Yeah, 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 I think
yeah,
you get what I'm driving at.
the design constraint of um, you should be able to put this in a drawer for 10 years and then turn it back on again is a good example of one of a design constraint that like is important and does inform like pretty much everything you do if that is actually a constraint for you, and is also somewhat hard to defend in an objective sense, but for some people is sort of like obviously a good thing to aim for. um,
Yeah, yeah, the like really there's not a single thing like this. It was a while ago when I realized like how hard this is. This is so hard. It's somewhat easier to articulate to what Tim apparently describes as grizzled engineers. But like anyone who has enough experience with the modern software stack and is almost like thoughtful enough to understand the tragedy of like dependency hell or something like that, you know? Um, uh, but it's very hard to articulate, especially now, like now that the seamlessness of say like iOS automatic upgrading um, exists. I feel like people really don't understand how kind of lost like the old world of computing is, and how it is totally possible that the existing world of computing that we live in will also just completely disappear. Um, but basically for technical reasons, right? Like, or what boils down to technical reasons, meaning that like, yeah, sure, like these companies do a pretty good job of maintaining your stuff, but like, you know, assuming that they can't actually live forever or even probably your entire lifetime, uh, how's that going to work out for you? You know? Um,
Right.
and so I used to think of these examples of like, well, what do I do with my floppy? Like, let's assume that only ever used Apple products and I got an Apple II and I committed myself to it and I took notes on the Apple II and I wanted to basically like have my notes have existed, all the way through to now. I mean, the upgrade, the responsibility of upgrading, right? Going from like whatever text file, like, well, how do you even choose your next protocol? You're like, okay, well, I've always written in plain text that was encoded in I don't know what would have been in, that, and then I've migrated it to some new file format, and then I'm going to migrate. Like every one of those migrations is done basically by hand, and the onus is like on the user to actually handle that migration. Um, it's a terrible example. I'm just pointing out that it's like hard to articulate how painful this is, and also how invisible it is, if that makes sense. Like it's only visible
Yeah.
to people who have like a certain existing perspective on software development. Like it's incredibly hard to explain, um, uh, which is, maybe means that we're whatever 53 minutes in, and I'm not sure we made that much progress on clarifying this point.
Yeah. It's um yeah. It's easy to look at an industry that is as young as this one, and they get like the number that goes through my mind is people are like, oh well, everybody dies. It's like, well, scientifically, of course, only 93% of people have died so far, and so 7% chance you live forever, right? Um,
Wait, where's that? How does that? I don't understand that.
it sounds like there's about 100 billion people that have ever lived, and
Oh,
7 or 8,
got it.
8 billion or so are alive right now.
Right,
Um,
right.
and so, like, yeah, exponential numbers or trends are strange that way.
Yeah,
And it with something then as young as technology, most of the software that most people have ever touched is still alive,
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
and it won't be. Um, yeah, I think it like another way in which we have to kind of go past what SQLite has done, as a like way of building software, is that um, while they're happy to explain the way that they build software, they're not particularly evangelistic, and they're not trying to
Yeah,
get
yeah,
other people to build software this way.
yeah,
Um, and one thing that we have to do if we want to be something, that's part of being networked, basically part of being something where people interact with each other, and where you have, hopefully a lot of different apps that people other than ourselves are creating,
yeah,
is that you have to uh, somehow explain and convert people to your way of building software, and
yeah,
you want everyone within the ecosystem to do that,
yeah,
with some amount of experimentation, because I don't think that we've hit the perfect way of doing it,
yeah.
but
I
we need
wonder if you
to,
could
yeah.
phrase it. You should phrase it. Maybe it's like actually almost you could correctly. It's like a koan, right? Like you need. It's almost like a question. Like the right way to phrase it might not be to try and kind of convince someone of the answer, but it's actually like it's just it's like how would you? Let's assume that I want to. Um, uh, Just gotta I'm thinking of like, you can phrase the USB stick example as a question, basically, right? Like, how would you do this? Like, how would you engineer this ability,
Right.
right? I want to be able to, I don't know, whether it's like kind of like take notes, store data. This is where it gets, take notes is relatively fine. Um, and then I want to put those notes away for a really long time, and I want to be able to plug them into whatever computer exists at that time that has a network connection. Because there are some implicit assumptions. I was thinking about how people often also trip on, they're like, well, what if like DNS disappears? Like, what if, how does this work? And I've always been relatively comfortable with that being a correct assumption that like basically we're so dependent on TCP IP and DNS that those are going to become just like they're going to be like buried in there's just no way they're ever going away, basically, because there's so much dependency on them. And so we can just assume that those things will, assume that, existing internet infrastructure exists in some still compatible form,
Right.
even sort of 30,
Even if
50
it's
years.
simulated.
Yeah, right. It could be simulated in many, many different ways. But you assume there's so many things that are going to need it that you're never going to do like a hard fork or whatever, it's never going to go away.
Mhm.
So assuming that fact, how do you actually get long-term both durability and it's durability and upgradability, right? So it's like I still have the thing, and it can upgrade itself into, I can basically get the new note-taking interface like over the network, like it can upgrade itself into some new form. Obviously, this
Yeah.
is a very poorly phrased question, but some version of it might be.
Yeah. Yeah. You want to be able to continue taking notes and be able to send those notes to someone else, even
Yeah.
like your kid who wasn't alive when you
Actually,
first
maybe, yeah,
started
be
taking
interesting to do
notes.
it. It's almost like the mail system, right? Or something like that. You're like, well, it'd be maybe like almost like email, for example, right? It's like, I want to be able to use this as a correspondence system where I like go offline. I can go on a multi-year expedition into the mountains, and I can come back and get all the messages that were queued to me and all the notes that I wrote into my system that was offline for that amount of time,
Right.
will then, get sent back over the network, right? And will arrive at their intended destinations. Um, uh,
Right.
and I'm basically like, you just design me a system that does that and show me that it's practically on track to actually work, like it has any chance of actual success. Uh, and we'll be, you know, you'll be close. Like if it's not Urbit, then I'd be curious to know what it is, basically. Um,
Yeah. And a lot of people think that exists already. That you can already do that. A lot of like even technical people. And if you ask, okay, how are you going to do it? Their answer inevitably involves like Gmail still existing and still being a profitable product for Google or something,
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah.
or some other. I
Or
mean,
it's like,
yeah,
oh, well, I'll just do it using text files and running my own mail server or something like that. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess that's technically an answer, but like no one's gonna use it. That's why I think like there's also this implicit sense of like, well, it's like a network effect thing. You're like, well, yeah, but we also want this to be something that everyone uses. And I can't explain why. It's hard for me to explain why do we care about that? It's like, well, I don't know. Because it actually, if it's widely distributed, I do think that has to do with almost like effect on the world. Like it's hard for me to say
yeah,
it's about anything else. Like I'm just like, yeah, because like it always comes back. I always find myself using rhetoric that's like very early America, like, where I'm like, I'm like, because you deserve to be free, and so does everybody. I mean, it's always a little bit cliche, but it is a kind of like, because people deserve their own tools, and if you're going to get, like, there's no way that just making that thing is enough. It also has to be used. Like, because if it's not used, it's not maintained, it's not kind of like held in trust, it's not developed, it doesn't, it has no future. Um, and so maybe that's the problem. It's like, if it's not, um, you know, uh, like maintained by a community and also used by a community, then when you go off on your expedition and come back, it has a risk of not existing anymore, right?
right.
Like what's going to continue its existence? I mean, that's so important. I think that's another thing that also bothers me about some of these purely technical solutions is I'm like, well, it's yeah, but it has to have like it has to have a social, there's a social component too. Otherwise, it actually doesn't really work like in practice in reality. Um,
Yeah, which is part of why you need to actually be evangelistic about it. Like if you,
yeah,
like, yeah, because you need a school of people who will, continue with that software and keep building software like that.
right. And I mean, it's interesting though, because then the way I've always thought about this is also like, well, yeah, it also has to be somehow kind of like mimetic, right? You have to have the people who use this thing have to also want to sort of engender that belief in those principles in others, which for me personally is always a source of tension in a way because I feel like, uh, yeah, I want the thing as a design, as a sort of naturally designer, I'm just like, oh, I just want the thing to be good. I don't want there to be this. I don't care about the kind of like marketing or social component of it. But I also, like analytically know that uh, that process has to exist. Like people, yes, people have to, not only do I have to evangelize it and believe in it, which is easy for me because I do believe in it, but other people have to be doing that too, in order for it to grow. And they have to do it not out of like some kind of, it can't be forced. It has to be like very natural. You have to like want to convince people of something. But yeah, I think maybe my other source of skepticism is like people like that has to people don't use things because of some existent belief in a widespread sense. They use things like the reason that someone uses something is because not because they like believe in it in a kind of like, uh, in the way that you might believe in like a story, but because it feels good. I feel like these are very different, at least in my mind, I've always these like totally different things. Like the reason that you live somewhere, the reason that you, yeah, buy a certain car or whatever, like the reason that you commit yourself to using something, it's like not a political act, never en masse, right? Small niches of people
Right.
will use something for kind of political reasons, but that's not that interesting to me.
I mean, the Copernican revolution is what is what people talk about in this space where you had, you had like Copernicus is like, okay, actually the sun is at the center of the universe.
Yeah,
Um, and we're all revolving around it. And isn't this so much nicer? Doesn't this feel so much better? And of course, the strongest argument against that was that his numbers were worse. All those epicycles they had gave much better predictions. Well, at least definitely measurably better predictions than Copernicus had for his entire life. Um, and yet he and the people that he was able to convince were still like, okay, but this is actually still a better system, even though the felt experience of it is worse. And
right.
if you actually want to know where the planet's going to be, you should really use the epicycles.
Not a great example for our like purposes, but
Well, everything goes way faster now, so like,
I do
uh,
think there's a real,
yeah,
yeah. I've been looking at like, if you look at, it's interesting to think about, yeah, I've been trying to look at basically population growth in new countries, like what do those curves look like? And then look at like growth of not like social networks, but like the internet and early internet like networks. Um, because and then you basically compress those. But it's interesting because I just think that Silicon Valley is so obsessed with a very specific type of exponential curve. It's like it's just like hunting for hockey sticks around here. Yeah, sure, fine. Hockey sticks are great, and uh, I don't. I mean, I look forward to generating lots of hockey sticks in different forms on top of Urbit. But there's something slightly different about kind of like society scale growth or like kind of fundamental network growth. I think those are different. I don't have a good enough evidence to fully support this yet, but I've been thinking about the fact that I'm like, I think those are kind of different things. And they have different qualities that you don't necessarily expect from like, I mean, yeah, they're just different categories of thing, I think. I gotta spend more time on that. I've just been thinking about that in the last couple of days. Um, I feel like we made a little bit of progress. I like the idea of this. This should be like an interview question. Like, design me a system in which I'm going to go on an expedition and I'm going to use it as a mail system. Basically, I'm already using it. So it's going to go offline for a certain amount of time. Scuttlebutt is kind of like this. It's like the other thing. That's like one of
Yeah.
their primary use cases. Um,
Yeah, you could take all those standard interview questions and be like, okay, write me a fizz buzz that will last forever. You know?
that's actually a really good one. Man, yeah, that's a good idea. Anyway, this is fun. I feel like we had kind of a slow start, so maybe we need to put one of those. We need to put like chapter markers in, like
Exactly.
meandering bullshit, somewhat interesting segment. Um,
Yeah.
anyway, we should do this again and do your. Obviously we've known each other for a long time, but there are probably things in your background that I don't know, and other people probably would want to know. It'd be kind of interesting to do a sort of standard people segment too. We
Yeah.
can do that again later. Uh, enjoy the warm weather.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'll talk to you soon.
I'll see ya.
See ya.